Most agree that more regulation is necessary when it comes to prescription drug prices, but how straightforward is that likely to be? That's the topic of this week's Healthcare Triage. Special thanks to Austin Frack, from whose Upshot column this episode was adapted. A majority of Americans prefer greater regulation of prescription drug prices, meaning government intervention to lower them. But don't count on a single policy to address a nuanced problem. Outside of a few government programs like Medicaid and the Veterans Health Administration, low-priced drugs are alike in that competition is the sole source of downward pressure on prices. When many generic versions of a brand-name drug enter the market, competition can push their prices 80% below the brand price, or sometimes even more. In contrast, high-priced drugs lack competition for various reasons. Consider two drugs, Humira and Daraprim. Humira, an injectable drug from AbbVie, is a good example. It's used to treat severe rheumatoid and other forms of arthritis, plaque psoriasis, and Crohn's disease. It's also the best-selling prescription drug in the world, with a nearly $40,000 annual price tag per person, even accounting for rebates. Since its approval by the Food and Drug Administration in 2002, Humira has been protected from direct competition by patents and FDA-provided market exclusivity. This government protection from competition is a source of profit intended as an incentive for innovation. Daraprim, currently manufactured by Viera Pharmaceuticals, formerly Turing, treats a life-threatening parasitic infection. It was discovered in 1952. In 2015, Martin Shkreli, then Turing's chief executive, increased Daraprim's price by more than 5,000% to $750 from $13.50 per pill. Mr. Shkreli was able to do this because Daraprim lacked competition, but the reason was different than for Humira. Daraprim's chemical structure and means of manufacture may be used by other drug manufacturers to make and market a generic equivalent. The obstacles to doing so aren't governmental, they're found in the market. If a competitor entered the market, it's likely that Viera would drop Daraprim's price, exactly what we'd expect and want from competition. But at a lower price, especially given the small market for this drug, the cost of starting production relative to the return may prove a deterrent. Daraprim isn't alone. Other drugs that have lost their patents have had rapid price increases for similar reasons. The price for Captopril, a drug for hypertension and heart failure, rose 2,800% in 2013. The same year, the price for clomipramine, which treats depression and obsessive-compulsive disorder, increased 3,700%, and the antibiotic doxycycline's price dropped 2,000 to 5,000%, depending on formulation, in 6 months. So what are some ideas to push down prices? The FDA has taken action to increase generic competition. A 2012 law authorized the FDA to charge generic drug manufacturers user fees, and those funds enabled it to speed up generic approvals. But this doesn't address barriers in the market that keep some prices high for drugs whose patents have expired. One way to address these barriers could be through importation, specifically not requiring manufacturers serving overseas markets to undergo approvals in the United States would reduce barriers to market entry, potentially increasing competition. The duration of market exclusivity varies by type of drug. Until recently, the vast majority of new drugs were so-called small molecule drugs produced through chemical processes. A manufacturer can expect to be granted about 5 years of market exclusivity from the FDA for these kinds of drugs, though some, like those that treat rare conditions, can obtain longer exclusivity. Some companies find elaborate ways to effectively achieve much longer periods of exclusivity. For example, some pertain to small changes in packaging or formulations. When the FDA treats these as new drugs, it can buy a company additional years of protection from competition and high prices. However, competition doesn't work well in every case. Take biologics, for example, which make up an increasing share of new drugs. They're made up of proteins produced by living organisms and can cost 20 times more to manufacture than small molecule drugs. These are much more complex and are regulated differently. Some of today's most expensive drugs are biologics, including Humira. The first biologic, a human formulation of insulin, was marketed in 1982. By 2016, they accounted for half of FDA approvals. Humira owes its popularity to its effectiveness. The same could be said of many other expensive biologic drugs, like Herceptin for certain kinds of breast cancer. To encourage investment in them, biologics get longer market exclusivity, 12 years, than small molecule drugs. As with the small molecule drugs, the exclusivity can be extended in various ways. But even after that, biologics are protected from competition to an extent because they are harder to duplicate than small molecule drugs. A biosimilar, a drug intended to mimic the therapeutic effect of a specific biologic, is not like a small molecule generic drug. A generic drug can exactly duplicate the chemical structure of the brand drug it is intended to mimic, but that's not easily achieved for biosimilars. Because they rely on living organisms, their structure and clinical performance depend on many subtleties of manufacturing. This means biosimilars may not behave exactly like original biologics, giving those original drugs a leg up in the market. Reflecting this, some of today's drug pricing proposals focus on biologics. A recently proposed change to Medicare would link the prices of many biologics to those in other countries which are lower. Another proposal has been to automatically reduce prices once their market exclusivity period has expired. A final complication in addressing prices is that for some drugs, it may not be a good way to achieve the pace of innovation we may want. Here, antibiotics offer a good example. Although we desperately need new antibiotics to combat resistant superbugs, few pharmaceutical companies are willing to invest in their development. The problem is that they would serve a market we want to be as small as possible. Ideally, nobody would need a powerful antibiotic, and there is no price at which a manufacturer would make a product that's not purchased. Something else to consider is that sometimes lowering drug prices could invite shortages, in which case it may be better to subsidize. Although there appears to be a mandate to lower drug prices, it's an issue that defies a simple solution. Hey, did you enjoy this episode? You might enjoy this whole series we did on orphan drugs and how policy affects their pricing. We need to thank our research associate Joe Sevitz and our Surgeon Admiral Sam, and like them, you can support the show at patreon.com/healthcaretriage. And I'd appreciate it if you bought my book, The Bad Food Bible. It's out in paperback.